This is a remarkable book, and it is for sale for people who haven't yet had the opportunity to read it. It also is reviewed in the upcoming issue of the New York Review of Books by an interesting reviewer who I guess has found a little bit of time on his hands. So it's Justice John Paul Stevens. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read the review, I commend it to you. It is a remarkable statement, honest, and I think not as defensive as one might have imagined, since he is the target of a fair amount of the criticism of this book. But it is also has some of the superlatives that I know we all think this book so well deserves. We have some terrific people who will speak a little bit about the book, a little bit about Bill, and they are people who've been indispensable to the production of this book, and therefore it's a tremendous honor for me to be able to introduce them. So Carol Steiker, who is the Henry J. Friendly Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She has succeeded in the chair that Bill had. And not only a criminal justice expert, but also a dear, dear friend of Bill's. Dan Richman, the Paul Kellner Professor of Law at Columbia, where he too is an expert in criminal law, criminal procedure, and also dear, dear friend of Bill's. Michael Klarman, who's the Kirkland and Ellis Professor here at Harvard Law School. And his friendship with Bill included convincing Bill to be a Red Sox fan, which I just think is a remarkable accomplishment. And David Skeel, the S. Samuel Arsh Professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, whose friendship with Bill transcended the usual limitations, shall we say, of the things that law professors tend to talk about. So they're going to speak in that order, and then you'll hear from me again.
So it's bittersweet to celebrate the remarkable achievement of Bill's book today. Bitter because of Bill's absence. He would really have enjoyed this event. Yes, he would have resisted the attention and insisted on his undeservingness, but I think he would have enjoyed it nonetheless. But as the dean, as Martha points out every year at graduation, no achievement, whether obtaining a degree or publishing a book, is a solo success, and I love it when she asks the family members of the degree recipients to stand and be recognized. So in this case, the extraordinary love and support of Bill's family throughout his long and difficult illness was crucial to the production of the book. In particular, the devotion of Bill's wife, Ruth, and his children, Sarah, Sam, and Sam's wife, Liz, and Andy. So it's very sweet to be here with all of you today to celebrate this book. There's a great deal to say about this book, as many have already started to do, including Justice Stevens. Today, I want to draw attention to the way in which the book reflects many aspects of Bill, his mind and character. In particular, his eclecticism, his iconoclasm, his humor, and his moral courage. First, Bill's eclecticism. In a world of increasing scholarly specialization, Bill was an original thinker who melded a variety of methodological approaches to forge a truly distinctive voice. Bill had a natural affinity for public choice theory that addresses the constraints and incentives shaping the decisions of public actors. But he was also drawn to history and criminology, and anyone who visited his office would see that it was crammed with history books and historical materials and stacks of data on crime and incarceration rates. And he was also a peerless lawyer who really understood in a deep way the ways in which legal doctrine shaped or sometimes failed to shape legal institutions. But despite his mastery of these very different approaches, Bill's own work was entirely jargon-free, and he managed to create a unique take and voice from his eclectic intellectual bents. Second, Bill's iconoclasm. Bill liked nothing more than to play the part of the boy in The Emperor's New Clothes and point out the failures of received wisdom and unintended consequences of reform efforts. I think perverse may have been one of his favorite words. But he was an equal opportunity iconoclast. For example, he tweaked the left, and you can see he really goaded Justice Stevens, for their support of the Warren Court's criminal procedure revolution, which Bill believed contributed to the massive run-up in incarceration over the past 40 years because of its focus on procedural rather than substantive regulation of criminal justice. But he also tweaked the right, in particular for their failed war on drugs, which Bill compared unfavorably to prohibition, which comes out looking surprisingly good by comparison in Bill's fascinating account. He would have made a great talking head on Ken Burns's recent documentary on the subject. But Bill was always an iconoclast with a twinkle. This is his humor. He loved to laugh, and I loved to make him laugh. Surprisingly, for such a serious and even often pessimistic book, there are a lot of laugh lines in this book. So I'm just going to share one of my favorites with you. It's Bill's giving an account of the Ossian Sweet case, which involved a black doctor who bought a house in a white neighborhood in Detroit in 1925. When an angry white mob surrounded the doctor's house, shots were fired from within the house, killing one of the people outside, leading to murder charges against Dr. Sweet and his wife, who were represented by none other than Clarence Darrow. The case went to trial twice, both times to all-white juries. The first jury hung, and the second jury acquitted. The trial judge for both of these trials was Frank Murphy, who went on to an extraordinarily illustrious career, first as mayor of Detroit, then governor of Michigan, cabinet secretary in FDR's cabinet, and then Supreme Court justice. So here's Bill in commenting on the surprising success of the judge who presided over the acquittal of a black man for killing an unarmed white man. Bill wrote, "Try to imagine Lance Ito mounting a successful campaigns for Los Angeles' mayoralty and the California governorship based on his handling of O.J. Simpson's murder trial." Despite the laughs, there's an underlying tone of moral seriousness to Bill's book, a tone that is notably absent from much of legal scholarship. The methodologies of public choice theory or history, for example, often seem to invite or even mandate a kind of moral neutrality or cool description that Bill emphatically rejected. His tone is indignant, his vision tragic. He uses words like disaster to describe our current criminal justice system, and words like justice and hope to describe its possible future. Bill's linking of his scholarship to his and our moral aspirations represents both his compassion for the fate of others and his moral courage. I witnessed firsthand how hard Bill pushed himself through pain and fatigue to complete this book. I often thought, and sometimes said, that he should take it easier and be kinder to himself. But now I have to say that I'm grateful that he left us with this sustained and masterful example of his vision and his voice, one that I can see and hear so clearly when I read it. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm really grateful for a chance to speak to you about Bill and a book that I'm really glad is actually selling and getting great reviews, and you should all be not just buying it, but blogging about it, and you should be reviewing it on Amazon. You know, we've got all the people out there. Even the most casual reader, and I really hope that many casual readers, not just academics, pick up this book because it's not just brilliant, it's a good read. And it just offers this vivid picture of a world where, a world of an adversary system without trials, a world where the jails are full of African-American men, and a world where sentencing just is untethered to reality. The more sophisticated readers, particularly those who are less familiar with Bill's work that came before this, will just recognize it as an amazingly audacious book. The way he would link areas that had not been linked before, and once he linked them, they could never be separated again, whether it's criminal procedure and substantive criminal law, criminology and law, public choice theory and legal doctrine. And as soon as the connection's made, you cannot go back, and I really do think, although Bill would do his all shucks routine if we pointed it out, that he contributed so much to advances on all the in creating a real area of criminal justice scholarship. I also think that this book, as Carol was saying, reads as if Bill put everything he had into it. Insights aplenty, deploying the full methodological diversity that he had come to champion throughout his work. And it has great stories too. You know, I think it's incredibly important, and I'm glad we have books on over-incarceration in the United States. It's even better that this book has a critique of over-incarceration and talks about the shootout at the OK Corral. You know, you don't get better than that. The people you meet in this book in itself make it worth reading. But even more than that, this amazing sense of historical contingency you get when you read the book. The idea the world could have been different. That the Warren Court deploys the criminal rights revolution not just at an interesting time in response to outrageous stories from the South, but just as murder rates are starting to go up and sentencing rates, punishment is actually going down. And the backlash to this, and I speak as somebody who is in awe of anyone who's written about backlash the way Mike Klarman has, who owns backlash right now. But Bill does this brilliant job of capturing how so much of our criminal justice policy came as a backlash to the Warren Court, moving into an area where there was essentially no criminal justice regulation. And I think that's sort of the chip on his shoulder that Justice Stevens hasn't quite worked through, that the response to the criminal justice revolution was higher sentences, not due process in any larger sense. I don't think that Bill's take on the criminal justice revolution of the Warren Court ought to suggest any judicial minimalism on his part. As a matter of fact, he champions a role for judges that is extraordinary via the Equal Protection Clause, and the way he talks about how the world that could have been, involving not the deployment of the Due Process Clause, but the Equal Protection Clause in a sustained way with enforcement that really gave citizens around the country, particularly in the Reconstruction days, but even extending to right now, a right to real enforcement, is, I think, one of the truly magnificent contributions of this book. The real engine, though, of reform that Bill points out is not judges, though. It's voters and jurors, and this book is written for them, and I think in a language that I really do hope will carry over to inform debate, or not just debate, change about the criminal justice world that Bill so brilliantly describes. Now, there is this sense that Bill put his all in the book, and I think as all of you who know him know, that's just not true. His all is not in this book. Some of his most brilliant criminal justice insights have been left out. The one that probably many of you know is his fervent belief that any criminal justice situation could be described with a quote from either The Godfather or Animal House. We would fight. I would try to get Star Wars into the mix. I generally lost that battle. You could do, in this building, I suppose we should talk about Legally Blonde, which he was also a fan of. But he was pretty strict on this rule. Another reason we could be pretty sure that he didn't put his all in is we know he would have written a really beautiful essay a couple years later trashing his book. This is not all of Bill. This is something that I think will have a wonderful life, but that Bill would have taken apart as he just took this pleasure in mining history and statistics and just finding a moral compass to the way we talk about criminal justice, and watching him take pleasure in doing this, even to the end, was incredibly, was something I won't forget. And it means that, this is where you need notes. he just took a delight in writing about what he was doing, and he took a delight in teaching about it. I hope that some of his students are here, because he loved teaching all of you and would talk about it constantly, and that he never lost this delight, and that he kept it while he was going through pain, and worse than that, was something that I think he owes to his family for helping him so much carry through. And I and everyone around who's ever had contact with Bill is just grateful to you and to the others around him for sustaining him. Thank you.
I'm mostly going to talk about Bill. I'm not going to talk about the book. Bill Stuntz was, to borrow a favorite baseball analogy, one of the ultimate five-tool law professors. He was an inspiring teacher, path-breaking scholar, an extraordinary institutional citizen, a fabulous colleague, and a wonderful human being. He was not, however, as his kids will attest, a wonderful driver. Bill nearly got the two of us killed when he was driving me to my recruitment dinner in Charlottesville in the fall of 1986. Now, not only was Bill not a terrific driver, but the situation was compounded by the fact that he'd just been hired by UVA a few months earlier, and Bill was already worried about not making tenure. As Pam remembers, this was a great joke among his junior colleagues at Virginia in the 1980s, that Bill Stuntz was so worried that he wasn't going to make tenure. This was not something that was particularly confidence-inspiring for the rest of us mere mortals. If Bill wasn't going to make tenure, what chance did any of us possibly have for accomplishing that? We might as well pack it in. In any event, Bill and I managed to survive that harrowing car trip to my recruitment dinner, and we began a friendship that's one of the most important and cherished in my lifetime. Not only a friendship, but an extraordinary collegial relationship. I feel as if most of what I've accomplished in my scholarly career was attributable at least half to Bill, and I would expect that most of the other speakers today would say something very similar. Both Bill and I taught criminal law for the first time in the fall of 1987, literally on a daily basis. We would talk about the game plan for class. We would spend sometimes a half hour or an hour a day talking about what we were going to do. And from these conversations, not only did I learn a lot about the substantive criminal law, but also a lot about pedagogy, about how to teach, which was a set of skills that I think came a lot more easily to Bill than they came to me or to many other people, I suspect. Bill was a huge success in the classroom from day one. The students adored him. He was a master of the material. He was comfortable at the podium. He was brilliant. He was funny. He was appreciative of their comments, and he engaged and stretched their minds. He was also accessible to students in a way I've never seen duplicated by another law professor. He never set office hours, but he was in his office virtually all the time, and he was always fair game. He would talk to students whenever they dropped by, usually for as long as they wanted. He took their ideas seriously. He offered them encouragement, and for many of them, he helped launch their own careers in legal academia. Now, everybody knows that Bill's brilliant scholarship redefined the field of criminal justice. I think everybody in the field would happily admit that. What I think has perhaps been less widely appreciated is the extent to which Bill's scholarship served as a model for his junior colleagues, both at Virginia and subsequently at Harvard, of what good legal scholarship should be: insightful, creative, engaging, rigorous. The standard of excellence that Bill set in his own work was a model to be emulated by an entire generation of junior faculty at Virginia and at Harvard who saw their intellectual ambitions stretched in a way that I think otherwise would not have been conceivable. Perhaps most importantly, though, Bill was the best colleague not only that I ever had, but the best colleague that I could ever imagine having. He was curious, he was knowledgeable, he was generous with his time, he was fun to talk to, he was the consummate team player. For my first 15 years or more in law teaching, he read literally every word that I ever published. His comments were always invaluable. They were detailed, they were incisive, they were most importantly encouraging and constructive. I would bet that during the late 1980s and early 1990s that Bill is thanked in the star footnote of more than half the law review articles published by the University of Virginia law faculty. And for most of those articles, it is the case that Bill actually asked the author if he could read the article rather than the author soliciting feedback from him. Bill was the glue that held the Virginia faculty together from 1986 to 2000, and he played a very similar sort of role, I am told, at Harvard in the last decade. I only joined the faculty a couple years ago. To shift sports analogies, Bill Stuntz was the Bill Russell of legal academia. He made all of his teammates the best that they could be. I may have stolen that from you, Pam. I can't remember. I think you said something like that once. Unlike Russell, however, Bill not only made his teammates better, he made his quote-unquote competitors better as well. Virtually every leading criminal procedure scholar in the country, Bill's age or younger, would happily tell you stories about Bill's extraordinary generosity of spirit. He helped improve their scholarship, he encouraged their development, he helped to promote their careers. I learned one other valuable lesson from Bill, leaving aside all the lessons about baseball that he thinks that he taught me. That lesson is this: people who do not see eye to eye politically can still respect, admire, and cherish one another. In our increasingly polarized political culture, people of all political stripes are too quick to vilify those with whom they disagree. Yet it was impossible for anybody who disagreed with Bill to dislike him because of that disagreement, to question his integrity, his goodwill, or his compassion for the least advantaged in our society. Through that example, he taught us that political disagreements often truly are about means rather than about ends, and that it's important to try to understand and to empathize with those with whom one disagrees rather than to demonize them. I can't count the number of people I've told that important lesson and from whom I learned it. Bill was one of the greatest law professors of his generation, but he was also a warm and generous friend and a terrific human being. I'm so glad that he lived long enough to write this amazing book, which is one of the best books that I've ever read about law. But I think I'm even gladder, selfishly, that he lived long enough to touch so many of our lives in the profound way that he managed to do so. Thank you very much.
So my remarks are going to sound familiar after the three sets of remarks that you've heard, and that's not surprising because Bill was who he was just a truly remarkable person. And I'm going to pull Carol into the way I'm going to set mine up, because what I would like to talk about for the next couple of minutes is the bundle of contradictions that Bill was, and I'm quoting from just a lovely tribute that Carol wrote about Bill in the Harvard Law Review a couple of months ago. I'd like to talk in particular about one contradiction in Bill, and that is that Bill gored everyone's ox. And yet, at the same time, he wanted to be liked. Now, those two things don't ordinarily go together, that you gore people's ox, and yet you want to be part of a community. But in Bill, they really did, and I think that gets to the heart of some of the things that made him special. So let me start by talking just for a minute or two about some of the oxes that Bill gored, and those oxes include himself. We've already heard mention Bill's famous critique of the liberal Warren Court of the 1960s, which figures prominently in Justice Stevens' new review. Bill argued, review in the New York Review. Bill argued that the Warren Court's constitutional protections for criminal defendants actually seem to have left them worse off, worse off rather than better off, which is a very conservative-sounding position. In the book, Bill, however, also critiques a number of very prominent conservatives, which makes him sound a little bit more liberal. He criticizes Ronald Reagan for drawing on an implicit racism in Americans in the way that Ronald Reagan portrayed the criminal justice system and the war on crime. Bill also criticizes a number of conservative legal scholars for their textualist interpretation of the Constitution and some of the implications that that has had in criminal justice. So he's very hard to pinpoint as either conservative or liberal or on a number of other dimensions as well. My favorite example in the book of Bill goring his own ox is his discussion, which has already been mentioned a couple of times in the book of Prohibition. In earlier work, Bill had called prohibition the classic example of what he called a self-defeating crime. And his argument was that when moral crimes are put on the books and the crime is simply too broad to be systematically enforced, what often ends up happening is it is discriminatorily enforced, and the crime that seems like a big success for the moral perspective actually can end up undermining the very moral norms that it's meant to reinforce. And prohibition was his classic example of something that seemed like a big success for those who thought drinking alcohol was immoral, but ends up having exactly the opposite effect, undermining support for the law and, if anything, encouraging the buying and consumption of alcohol. I thought this was a great idea, and I love the concept of a self-defeating crime, and so I used it in lots of my own work, including a couple of articles that I co-authored with Bill. And when I would talk about the work in settings like this, it often was the only thing that resonated with people. They would be asleep for most of the discussion, and then I would start talking about self-defeating crimes, and all that they'd wake up and their heads would start nodding. So imagine my surprise when I read The Collapse of American Criminal Justice and learned that prohibition, rather than being a disaster, was actually a great success. I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I go back on the road. But I'll figure it out, I suppose. And I can't ask Bill, unfortunately. Bill came to believe that the enactment and then the subsequent repeal of prohibition was actually a success because it showed democracy in action. It showed an experiment that was tried, but when it failed, the American public concluded that it had failed and voted it out. And so in the book, Bill describes prohibition as our good culture war, something I never would have imagined coming out of his mouth. So how could someone who was so contrarian also be so beloved? And as we all know, Bill was very much beloved, both as a person and as a writer. Whenever Bill posted a blog post on the blog that we co-authored together, I was sure within a day to have 3 or 4 messages, the tenor of which was typically something like, your posts, speaking of me, they're not too bad, but now Bill's posts, those are really, really special. I think that one of the things that made Bill so special and so interesting and so beloved is that he took very, very seriously 2 qualities that he emphasized in a really well-known commentary he wrote called Faculty Clubs and Church Pews. And if you haven't read that commentary, David Brooks singled it out in early 2005 as one of the best essays of the previous year. It is I would commend it to you. It's very well worth reading. In that essay, Bill argued that the 2 communities in his life, the 2 communities that he absolutely loved, and he says this in the essay, his Christian community and this community, his law school community, could learn from one another. And in particular, what he emphasized that the 2 communities could learn from one another is that his scholarly community, he felt, could learn humility from his church community, surprisingly enough. And he felt that his, I'm sure some of my colleagues aren't humble, he felt that his church community could learn from his scholarly community, and I'm going to quote here, the willingness to test beliefs with tough-minded questions and arguments, and to seek out what is true, even if it meant revising your previous beliefs. Bill had both of these qualities in abundance. Everybody who talks about Bill talks about his humility. He also tested out his ideas. He revised them. As Carol has said, he had a perverse fascination with undermining conventional views on the particular issue that he happened to be focusing on. Together, it seems to me that these two qualities were part of what was at the heart of what made Bill so special. And these two qualities were reflected both in his life and in his writing. More generally, it seems to me that they got to his deep sense of the importance of truth, and in his deep sense of the importance of the golden rule, of Christ's command that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. Bill was all about relationship. Anyone who knows him knows his love for Ruth and for the kids, come up constantly in his conversation, his love for his law school community, his love for its church community. And it doesn't seem to me at all accidental that almost the only notes of hope in The Collapse of American Criminal Justice, which is a truly amazing book, almost the only notes of hope are at the end when he talks about ways forward, and those notes of hope are about relationship. In Bill's view, one way we might make our criminal justice system better is through more local democracy. Bill believed that relationship, community, local democracy can make things better in a very real way, and I think that's the vision he's left us with in this book.
Well, in a shameless plug for the book, let me just add, it's a really good read. And those of you who haven't read it, it's as good a book on history as it is on law. You just understand in a way that I don't think anyone else has helped us understand. Where has this country been and where is it going? And so I just personally highly commend it. And again, you can buy a book right over there. But it gives me the chance also to acknowledge Elizabeth Knoll, who is the editor from Harvard University Press, who helped make sure this book happened. And Phoebe, who's helping to publicize it. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful that colleagues and friends are here from DC, from Charlottesville, from New Haven, from New York, all over. And although she's going to hate it, I'm going to ask Ruth to come up here because you have a copy of Bill's book that I'm going to borrow. And it's already, okay, the book, where is it over there? And we're going to ask everyone who's here, if you have a chance, to sign this copy of the book, because if Bill were here, he would be signing books for everyone. So let's sign a book for Ruth. But Ruth, I do want you to come up here because I have something for you. We've taken your book from you, and we're going to give you this copy of the cover. So I invite you all to stay and talk and drink and sign books and celebrate. And, you know, maybe next time you see a friend, say what Bill always would say was, I'm probably wrong about this, but thank you all for being here.